These cases remained unsolved for decades before they were finally solved in 2020. Thanks to a combination of fresh perspective, new technology, and previously unknown information, the families of these victims can rest easier at night knowing justice will be served. Number 5. 40 years ago, a grisly discovery was made when police found the lifeless body of a man lying in the bed of a truck next to an unnamed woman who'd been attacked and left to face her fate. The crime scene was located on East Illinois Street in Phoenix, Arizona. Luckily, the woman survived the attack and was the starting point for an investigation that carried on from 1978 to early 2020. The man that lost his life was 23-year-old Fernando Carlos, a working-class man described as friendly and kind. At first, the horrible crime scene seemed like an easy solve, with fingerprints from the scene matching those of 21-year-old Glenn Edward Williams. About a year after the tragedy took place, investigators believed they had sufficient information and evidence to arrest Glenn. He was taken into custody and spent a short time in jail as he awaited official charges and a trial. When it came time for the courts to quickly review the facts of the case, some argued that the evidence available was not enough. After this, Fernando's family grieved and worried for 4 decades, wondering if their loved one would ever have justice. It seemed that the case would remain forever cold until a spark was lit when Phoenix police decided to revisit the case. Thankfully, the evidence that was previously collected, such as Glenn's fingerprints, were properly protected, packaged, and filed in the department evidence locker. This made the second round of investigation a lot easier for cold case detectives, who rarely have substantial evidence to work off of. In addition to pulling the old details off the shelf, Phoenix PD also compared a DNA sample using technology that was completely unavailable in 1979. The tech confirmed that the sample matched the former suspect, Glenn. This combination of details was enough to gain court approval. Glenn was arrested in early 2020 and awaits his trial for the crimes he possibly committed. Although the long arm of the law has not yet labeled him guilty, Fernando's family believes that this is a crucial step in the right direction. Number 4. 21-year-old Helen Brzezinski moved from Massachusetts to Douglas County, Colorado, where she lived the average life of a young college student, studying for a better future. She held an internship position at a local news station, and while she didn't have much family around, she had many friends and colleagues that shared in mourning her after she was found. On January 16, 1980, her remains were found in an open field near a public park. The medical examiner confirmed what was obvious to crime scene investigators. She'd been beaten and wounded multiple times with a sharp object. A case was sparked as authorities collected all the evidence they could. Eventually, it became evident that she was abducted while walking along her usual route home. It remains unclear if she was forced into the vehicle or if she went willingly, as though hitching a ride. Either way, investigators found fingerprints and other DNA-related evidence at the scene of the crime. Sadly, necessary technology wasn't present in 1980 to properly identify a suspect. The case grew cold, and investigators locked up the evidence and files to be reviewed at a later date. Over the course of about 40 years, the case was picked up on 2 separate occasions. Although the reasons are unknown, police still were not able to match the DNA until early 2020, when the case was popped open for a 3rd time. Finally, the evidence was examined using new technology and genealogy methods. After sorting through the details, it came down to 2 suspects, James Clanton and his brother. However, his brother was eventually ruled out. This left James as the main suspect. Investigators found that James was living in Florida, so detectives traveled south and followed him closely for a short period of time. Finally, after James left a bar late one night, an investigator was able to obtain a DNA sample from the rim of his beer mug. That sample was compared and confirmed to be a match in the case. James was arrested in January of 2020, and he's currently awaiting his day in court. Number 3. Naomi Sanders was a 57-year-old single woman living in Vallejo, California at the time of her passing. On February 26, 1973, Naomi had completed her average day and was preparing an evening dinner after work when a friend called in to check in on her. According to the friend's statement, Naomi seemed perfectly fine and in good spirits during their conversation. However, the next day, Naomi didn't arrive at work, and it soon became apparent that something bad had happened. Coworkers and friends tried desperately to get a hold of her until someone finally decided to check her apartment, under the assumption she may have slept in or gotten sick. Their knocks went unanswered when they had tried to turn the door handle. It was unlocked and opened easily. Unfortunately, Naomi's friend walked in on a traumatic scene. They soon found Naomi lying on her floor, only half dressed. Authorities were immediately contacted and officers arrived after a few short minutes. It was clear that whoever took her life was welcomed into the home, as there were no signs of a break-in. This was likely because Naomi worked for her apartment complex and propped a sign in her front window that always said open. It wasn't unusual for potential tenants to arrive at any given time with questions regarding available units. At first, investigators believed that her attacker entered in such a manner, gaining her trust by pretending they were interested in the wonderful apartments she'd managed. It was later proven that this was not the case. A medical exam confirmed that the victim had been physically attacked and assaulted by an unknown male. DNA of this male was found inside of Naomi, which suggested a particular kind of abuse. Unfortunately, the proper technology and tools were not available for this case to be easily opened and shut. Witness interviews suggested that Naomi had no ex-lovers, enemies, or loan sharks waiting for their time to strike, which made the investigation all the more difficult. It didn't take long for things to go cold. In 2014, the case was revisited again for the first time, and clothing from the victim showed traces of semen, but the DNA sample created didn't match anyone that was booked in the database at the time. Another small break came in 2018, when investigators were finally able to link the DNA to two suspects, one of which was quickly ruled out. The second suspect had passed away a few years before, and his DNA could not be collected. Thankfully, using genealogy and genetic testing, they were able to confirm that the man's son was a close enough DNA match for his father to be considered guilty. It was announced that Robert Dale Edwards was most likely her attacker. He was 22 when the crime was committed. As for a motive, it was revealed that Robert was the son of Naomi's former employer, but more specific details as to why he felt the need to end her life remain unknown. Number 2. In early 1967, then 26-year-old Anita Louise Pateau moved from her hometown in Maine to start a new life in California. She worked there for about a year and spoke with her family as often as she could. In February of 1968, Anita sent a letter to her loved ones explaining her adventures in California. She happily described seeing the sights of Hollywood and the beautiful parks across the state. She signed off saying she would return home in May of that same year. Sadly, this is the last time her family heard from her before she completely vanished. Her family obviously worked day and night to find their loved one over the course of 50 years. Despite the setbacks and the official case being labeled as cold, her family still lost sleep every night, hoping that they would someday find Anita. Around the same time she went missing, a Jane Doe was found on a farm after the victim had been attacked and cut. At the time, DNA testing was far from what we know today. Due to the cases being so far in distance, the connection between this random Jane Doe and Anita wasn't confirmed for several decades. In 2020, the case was pulled and cold case detectives used the perfectly preserved evidence that they'd already had to finally make the connection. This was a huge step in the case, and it was awarded more hours of work by higher-ups who sought justice. A short time after her identity was revealed, the investigation led detectives to finally finding a suspect. Male DNA from the scene was tested using new advancements, and Johnny Crusoe was identified as the attacker. Unfortunately, Johnny had passed away in 2015 due to a rapid form of cancer. He was never forced to see his day in court. Also, it seemed that a motive would never be shared. In a statement provided to Inside Edition, Johnny was discharged from the army for a pattern of being quick to anger, easy to feel unjustly treated, chronically resentful, immature, and impulsive, so it's very likely that his rage was at the center of the crime. Despite this attack lacking a serving of justice, it did provide Anita's family with some much-needed closure, as they were finally able to properly lay Anita to rest. Number 1. Nancy Daughtry was last seen by her lover on July 15, 1986, when he dropped her off at home after a chill night at the local bar. The following morning, Nancy's lover was unable to get a hold of her for several hours. After she failed to show up for work, he called the authorities to request a general welfare check on the hardworking young mother. After knocking and banging on the door proved to be a fruitless practice, force was used to enter the home. Nancy's remains were found lying inside, and the crime scene made it clear that she'd been attacked by an intruder, a fact that the medical examiner confirmed. Her clothing was collected along with various DNA samples collected from the body and around the house. These samples obviously belonged to her attacker, but a match could not be found thanks to the setbacks in testing at the time. Her family and friends mourned for several years, hoping that someday the criminal that took her life would be found and put behind bars. Unfortunately, that satisfaction was delayed for decades. Over the years, Nancy's case was opened several times. While DNA testing continued to improve, so did the chances of locating a suspect. In 2020, the case was finally solved when a DNA profile proved to be a match for a man named Michael Carbo Jr., now 52 years old. Michael attended school with Nancy's older children, and it seemed the attack was completely unprovoked and may have been fueled by a romantic obsession he held for Nancy. An arrest was made, and while Michael still awaits trial, Nancy's family has found some peace in knowing the case will finally move forward and eventually be solved for good. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you like this video, be sure to click that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.